You're listening to Sox in the Basement, a production of the Broadcast Basement Limited, where every show is 30 minutes of good and comes from a basement bar on the south side of Chicago. Pull up a stool, pour a cold one, and join us right now for Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always at soxinthebasement.com. Welcome to 2025, White Sox fans. How was your 24? Like, here's the thing, bud. I've been kind of thinking about it this week. The comparison to the White Sox and my own personal life. Like, Sox in the Basement has been around now. This will be our 7th year at some point here in 2025. And we only made it this far because of the listeners that are out there listening to this show right now. And we love you and we appreciate you. We are one of the longest independent White Sox podcast out there in terms of how long we've been around. We get a ton of listeners. We're very appreciative of it, and I am going to work very hard to step up my game here in 25, because 24 was a battle for me. Like, here's the thing, 23 was really hard. 23 for me was the death of a marriage. It was just me looking in the mirror saying, can I continue to run this business that I started out of nowhere, the Broadcast Basement? And can I be profitable enough that I can support my family? Because the kids are going to be with Dad, the way that everything went down. And I'm not going to get into it, but that's how this is going to go. And will I be able to pull all this off? Can I keep the house? And that's what 24 was for me. 24 was a fight, personally for me. It's a massive fight. It was a fight in divorce court. It was a fight for the kids. It was a fight for everybody's well-being. It was a fight to make sure they could stay in their schools. It was a fight to make sure that one of them go off to college. It was a fight to make sure this company, which Sox in the Basement is just one of many podcasts on, that turn a profit and provide and put food on my table and take care of my children, this company had to get bigger. And it did. Somehow in 24, everything seemed to fall into place. There were late nights I was exhausted. There were times where I wasn't sure it was going to work out, but it has. And in fact, today, as we record, we're recording on the eve of New Year's. You're listening to this on New Year's Day. Today, I approve the final wording that will end the divorce and will allow me to move forward in my life. And it's good for everybody that's involved. And that's a big accomplishment. And I will enter 2025 with more podcasts on the network than ever before, more contracts signed with advertisers and government agencies, and I'm actually putting together podcasts for more than one South suburban village or city or town. They all call themselves different things. And the expansion continues. And 2024 was about survival. It was rough, but it was about survival. And I look at the White Sox a little bit like how I look at 25 for me. Like, 25 for me is possibility. Like, you're not going to instantly jump in there and be on a yacht, right, Ed? Like, I'm not going to like walk into 25 and by April it's going to be me and like 7 supermodels riding through the Riviera. Like, that's not happening. Just like the White Sox aren't competing in 2025. That's not happening. But the base was built. The battle happened in 2024. The front office changes that were made by Chris Getz and the structural changes and getting over the stuff that the old man was doing. I'm going to move the team. He's slashing payroll, but he's still stuck in his old ways. And now we hear about the presentation and the idea that you need to change things. And now Marco Patti's out and they change how things are going with the international scouting. And they change how things are happening in the building. And different people now report to different people than they did before. And there's accountability, supposedly. There's hope. And that's what the White Sox are in 25. They have hope. Just like I have hope, they have hope. Because there's endless possibilities for good. And that's what my 25 is, and that's how I'm kind of looking at the White Sox. It's not going to happen overnight. But when you look at the farm system, when you look at some of the players, and we're going to get into it today because there's some interesting articles out that really put into perspective some of the players that have been added into this system over the past year and what they could do for this team. And you look at what could happen down the road. I feel positive about 2025, even though I know most White Sox fans still feel the sting of 24. And yes, I feel the sting of 24 as well. But I'm going into 2025 with my sunglasses on because there's a little bit of brightness.
Well, okay, so what you're talking about there
I don't even know what I'm talking about, Ed. I'm just ranting. It's New Year's Day. I'm on a New Year's Day rant.
You're talking about it being darkest before the dawn.
Right. Well, that's the thing. It is
what you're saying. You personally had a 2024 that at times was really, really, really bleak.
Dark, baby.
And
it was dark.
Yeah, it was dark. It was dark. And the White Sox had the darkest season in Major League history. I mean, and it's really, really bleak when you look back at the 2024 White Sox and you look at what they were, right? Because that's all you can do is kind of look at what are they on the field and what do they represent. And you had an owner that just did not seem to care. He's more worried about putting on a show about, moving to Nashville. He's more worried about, trying to find a neighborhood in Chicago that he can move the stadium to, seemingly in response to the fact that the Bears were going to move out of Soldier Field. You have quietly, and you and I have talked about what Chris Getz did to the front office. Quietly, what Chris Getz did was something that, had this been done, had this been accomplished, had there been a philosophy and a plan and an understanding of how Jerry's going to operate.
10 years ago.
Going back
10 years ago, this whole thing that just happened in the beginning of this decade would have gone a lot differently, I think.
20 years ago, it would have helped because it would have been sustainable, okay?
They would have done a better job on the Chris Sale trade. They would have done a better job building the team for the run that they thought they were going to have if they would have had different things in place and different people running things. Like, I'm convinced of that now after watching what Getz has done. Like, you're right. There were horrible things in 24 for me, and there were horrible things for the White Sox, but I'm focusing on the positives because there's a lot of good. Like, there's been some really good things that have happened to me in 2024 that bode very well for 25. There's good things that have happened even though you weren't paying, because sometimes you could focus on the negatives, Ed. Sometimes you can look at the things that are always going wrong. You can look at the box score. You can look at what's going on in the field. You can look at the way that the owner's treating everybody, and you can kind of lose that hidden there in the background, not really being talked about very much, is what could happen next. I'm talking about the Brian Bannisters of the world and the Ryan Fullers and the new guys that are in there and the voices that are in there and the way that I'm seeing a different process for how they decide who they want to have on their team and what they want to do, that makes me feel like 24 can go into the rearview mirror. Like, I'm putting it in the rearview mirror. The White Sox should do that as well. Maybe the fan base should do that a little bit as well. I'm not saying forget it. I'm not saying forgive Jerry Reinsdorf. I'm not saying hold his feet to the fire or change your opinion about how you feel like things have been run. But it may be time to say, let's just see what happens next. Because if you live in 24, man, you'll be miserable forever.
Well, and again, fandom should be a long-term process, right? And for those of us that have really, our White Sox fandom has spanned the entirety of the Jerry Reinsdorf era, we've known nothing but the disappointment of the Reinsdorf era, because even when there has been success, it's been so fleeting that we've clung to it with the hope that, like, okay, they can recreate this. But there's really no way to recreate 2005 when 2005, and looking back at it, was just such a lightning in a bottle moment. And so many things fell into place that were just so kind of ridiculously convenient that it couldn't be sustained. And the fact that it couldn't be sustained was based on, you just can't always put together a pile of cheap veterans that are going to go out and win a World Series. And what you see now is you see Chris Getz getting into this and going, all right, I'm not trying to do that, because we've looked at the free agent signings and they are nothing really, right? I mean, it's a reclamation project here. It's a guy that has a history with Ryan Fuller and Austin Slater. You've got little bits and pieces, but you don't have Chris Getz sitting there saying, I'm trying to put together, this major league roster, and we think that this guy is going to have a future with us. We think that this guy's great. No, what he's doing is he's sitting there going, it's a process. At this point, the scouting department's completely different, which means that the drafts are going to be different. The international signings are going to be different. The philosophy of how they develop players all the way through the system and what they bring to the field at the major league level is going to be the same all the way throughout. That's why Brian Bannister and Ryan Fuller exist, because they are there to create a template for what goes on all the way through the system. At least in theory, that's what we're supposedly having happen in this new wave era. And what it is that gives you hope for the future is that Chris Getz will be able to continue to act as a Jerry whisperer, right? That's the one little positive that we got out of some of this stuff is that Chris Getz seems to understand how to speak Jerry.
That's the one thing I used to beg for, right?
Yeah.
I want to get into that because that's something we've talked about around here for years. But first, let's talk about Hyatt Home Medical Equipment. Switch to a new age of life, folks, with Hyatt Home Medical Equipment. Keep mom and dad, grandma and grandpa out of assisted living. Make it so they can get around on their own and live independently with stair lifts, ramps, grab bars, lift chairs, and even bathroom remodeling. They work with insurance and have 0% financing for qualified individuals. If you are unhappy with your CPAP machine vendor, switch now. They will directly mail supplies to you. They also have the latest and greatest in continuous glucose monitors. Learn all about Hyatt Home Medical Equipment, what they have and what they can do for you at hhme.com. What has been one of the overarching philosophies of this show? Something that has been talked about since we started years ago. The idea that you can't change the owner. Until he's dead, you can't change the owner. And my feeling on a general manager is that, one, he needs to be heartless. He needs to be able to sit there and say, yep, you're done. You're DFA'd. You're not in the plans. Or you need to change. You need to do this. And if you don't do it, you're not going to make it on the team. You don't have a guaranteed spot. And I'm not going to sit around and wait for you. That's one of the things that I want. I also want a general manager that understands what he's working with in terms of an owner. Like if you walk in to any Major League Baseball team and you decide you're going to run it like you're the Dodgers and they're not spending money like the Dodgers, you're going to fail. If you go to Pittsburgh or Tampa Bay, for example, and you walk in and you expect to have a $200 million payroll, you're going to fail as a general manager because you're going to build your team under this belief that they're going to operate like a big boy team, and they're never going to do that. And the problem with the White Sox is there was a belief in that front office that the old man would come through when they needed it. And the Machado thing really tells you. I mean, that's when Kenny Williams was crying his tears underneath his dark sunglasses the day that Machado went elsewhere. A lot of that is because Jerry wouldn't agree to the contract that Machado had always said that he wanted, which was 10 years and $300 million, which is what he got. And the Sox did everything they could because when it came time for the old man to actually give the guarantee, oh, sure, there was more money that was not guaranteed because that would have never made it to Manny Machado, and he was smart enough to understand it. But when it came to the guaranteed money, the old man wouldn't give it. And the problem that the general manager of the White Sox and whatever Kenny Williams was above him, but the guys who were in charge, the problem they had was that they never understood who their owner was. That is the shining light in the backdrop of a bad 24 that gives me hope in 25, is that I feel as though Chris Getz knows exactly who his owner is. And that's the most important thing about this. Like if anything's going to work, if you're going to have anything to root for as a fan of the White Sox over the next couple of years, it's going to be because the general manager knows who the owner is. If Chris Getz leaves, if he's fired, if another owner comes in and a new general manager comes in, you always want the general manager to understand who the owner is so that they make a plan based upon the restrictions, the issues, the problems, and everything else that comes with that owner, knowing what they can get and what they can't get. So they're not caught with their pants down and then you don't have a rebuild that falls short because you weren't able to do the most important things like find that marquee star that you were going to build around. You have to understand, like a general manager for the White Sox has to understand that as ridiculous as it sounds, this owner will always be resistant to the idea of trading with the Cubs and teams within his own division. I believe some of that comes from Jerry Reinsdorf. I believe it because I've seen it happen through multiple general managers, that fear. And that also, this owner does not play well with the biggest agent in baseball. He doesn't like it. And so as a GM, you need to understand that as you're building your team, these are restrictions you're going to run into. Money and those ridiculous little things that happen. And so that's my only hope. I feel like Chris Getz gets it. I'm interested to see whether or not Chris Getz is able to whisper in Jerry's ear an idea that we came up with recently, which was Jordan Montgomery kind of coming over to the White Sox to get him off the hands of the Diamondbacks who don't want him. Their owner doesn't want him. You have all this room in your payroll. You could bring him over and eat a lot of that and maybe even pull a prospect or two and then flip Montgomery at the deadline because he's going to pitch a lot better this year. I believe that all those pitchers that were held out early in 24 because Boris was trying to get the most amount of money, like Snell and Montgomery, they suffer from not being able to be with their regular team, going through their regular pitching things and doing their regular spring training. They're going to be good this year. And if they really don't want him in Arizona and you have all this room, that should be the coup move. That should be the move that makes you sit back and say, Chris Getz knows how to play chess, which is take that salary, move him over, get another piece because they're trying to unload him. They just went out and got Corbin Burns, right, Ed? So get another piece, pull it over, and then flip him at the halfway point. And be able to convince Jerry, don't worry, you're not even going to pay all this contract because the people that take him at the deadline are going to pay some of that deal. And that's the move right there. That's the move I want to see happen. That's the move I'm rooting for right now this offseason.
Yeah, well, and if they can come up with a trade, and Corbin Burns going to the Diamondbacks, everyone's like, oh, I don't understand that. Well, and then you read that, yeah, okay, Corbin Burns just wants to live in Arizona, and that's why he went to the Diamondbacks. It's like, okay, well, it doesn't matter. Who gives a crap why Corbin Burns went there? Now the question is, does it open up an opportunity somewhere else? Okay, and when you're the White Sox, that's the reality that you're going to be in every offseason, frankly, under Jerry Reinsdorf. And unless a new owner comes in and decides he's going to spend and he's going to be a major market owner, under a Jerry Reinsdorf regime, under this small market mentality, you're always going to be looking at not what are the big moves and can the White Sox be there. That's where Kenny Williams fell on his face so many times, was he was never going to be with the big boys, but he always said he had a seat at the table. No, you didn't. Kenny, you didn't have a seat at the table. You were standing by the table looking at them, hoping that one of them would invite you to sit down, and they never did because they knew they couldn't, because you couldn't afford to be at the table. But what you can do as the White Sox, and this is where I wonder if Chris Getz is paying attention, is as these teams that are making the big moves make their moves, does it open up a door? Does it open up a window? Does it open up an opportunity with that team or with another team for Chris Getz to sit there and say, I can fix a problem that created for you, or I can fill a hole that created for you? Burns is a big ticket item for a Diamondbacks team that is not a big ticket spender.
Right, and Montgomery took an option that's a huge amount of money that their owner was very publicly vocal.
Publicly said, I don't want this man on my team.
Right, so he doesn't want him on the team. He thinks he's overpaying him, and he's spending a lot of money, and he could use the salary dump. Now, I'm sure his general manager's like some competitor out there, some team that really needs a Jordan Montgomery might give us something. So that's what they're going to hold out for at first. But this also seems like the kind of thing that if they get desperate and just want to get rid of that money, like if you have an owner that just wants to get rid of that player and get rid of that money, this is something that Chris Getz has to go whisper to Jerry Reinsdorf and say, look, we're going to take on this contract. It's still going to get you well below $90 million this year that you're going to spend. You're going to be at the bottom of Major League Baseball. It's going to give you somebody that you get to throw out there for the season ticket holders. They're going to love it. They're going to, oh, look at that. We're going to actually have a pitcher.
Here's our opening day starter.
Oh, our opening day starter is to Jordan Montgomery. And I'm going to be able to flip it for more players. You're not even going to pay the entire year for Montgomery.
Yeah, because he just needs to rehab. All Montgomery needs to do is just rehab his image a little bit.
That's all he needs to do.
Prove that last year was not the beginning of the end for him.
It's just a next level type move. It's the idea of saying, okay, look, I know what the Diamondbacks are going to do first. It would be predictable. The Diamondbacks are now going to try to move Montgomery. That's what I would think they're going to do. Even if there's no buzz about it, even if you're hearing they're not going to. The owner doesn't want him around and thinks he's overpaying him. The thing is whether or not other teams are going to sit there and say, well, I want to take on that payroll on a roll of the dice. What if he isn't as good as he had been in previous years? What if he isn't worth that money? But the Sox have all that flexibility in their payroll. And again, you are still seriously lowering payroll from last year if you take him on. And if it does pan out, you deal him and you use it for team building, and you can pitch it to your owner of, you're not going to pay for this whole thing. If it doesn't work out, you're not on the hook for next year. He's gone.
Yeah, he's a 1-year gamble.
I would rather have Getz go to Reinsdorf and ask for money to do that than go to Reinsdorf and ask for money for an aging hitter for the lineup or a couple of pitchers that would have a veteran presence on the team in the middle of the rotation. You know, I'd rather him take his shot at that, right? I think that's a more valuable piece because I think that's a piece that you move later and you get really valuable pieces back at the midway point. And he wouldn't be a bad guy to have sitting in there anchoring your rotation while you're trying to figure things out with these young pitchers. Please, I hope they're considering that. I don't know if it's possible. You need the other team to be interested in it. I just don't know if there's a lot of teams in Major League Baseball that want to pick up Montgomery's salary if they're competing and have to give up a prospect for him, because it's not a very good deal. But it's a good deal for a team like the White Sox that may want to flip him. Sox in the Basement listeners trying to make the most of your money, give a call to Tom Walsh, your Edward Jones financial advisor. Located on the corner of 111th and Kedzie, but serving the Chicagoland area, Tom has a get-to-know-you approach and a do-the-right-thing attitude. He's been doing this for decades. It's all about knowing your options when you're investing and planning for your retirement. No matter what stage you are at, it costs nothing to check in with Tom. Give Tom Walsh, your Edward Jones financial advisor, a call today, 773-779-0023. Edward Jones, member SIPC. I looked at CBS Fantasy Baseball to get ready for my new season. Now that my fantasy football season is over and has ended in shambles, again, knocked out in every league the week before the championship game after having just incredible regular seasons and then just getting knocked out, which is just how fantasy football works, right? And Cooper Kupp walk off a bridge and just never come back.
Right.
Okay.
So many people got Cooper Kupp out of the playoffs.
And as far as I'm concerned, I'm rooting against the 49ers for the rest of my life after I kept Christian McCaffrey as a keeper in one of my leagues. And that's really the whole difference in how that season went. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
He's questionable. What, for the whole year? For life? Can we be more specific? But now I'm looking at fantasy baseball again. And so I've started to read some articles. And our friend Scott White from CVS Fantasy, who's been on the show before, has put out his top prospects at every position. And I love looking at this stuff and trying to put it through the lens of Major League Baseball and the White Sox in particular. And there's a couple of interesting things that I noticed when he put it out. Now, he's putting out 10 to 15, sometimes in the case of outfielders, 25 players that you as a fantasy baseball fan should be looking at as a prospect that you want to keep track of that may make it to the majors this year, or if you're in a dynasty league, you want to hold on to because they're going to be worth something in the long term. They're going to be very good offensively. They're going to have prominent roles on their team, meaning you can look at like a prospect list. And this is how I kind of differentiate this. You can look at a prospect list and they'll tell you this guy, his arm's good. He's got all the tools. He's got this. He's got to put it together. So that's his value. And a guy like Scott White is going, this is where he fits in his organization. This is how valuable he is. He's actually going to get some playing time maybe. And this is how he may translate in terms of production in the majors. So it's kind of a different way of looking at it. I get excited when I see White Sox players on these lists because it means guys coming soon, guys expected to do well.
He might actually produce. Right. He might produce enough to the point where somebody who is a casual fan, we'll call it a casual fan, but somebody who really only looks at the offensive side of things and doesn't care about defensive metrics, doesn't care about the tools that are involved in the arm or the ability to take another base and that kind of IQ. What we're really concerned about with fantasy baseball is, does he put the bat on the ball? Does it go out of the ballpark with some regularity? Does he swing and miss too much? And, in the case of some leagues, it might just be as simple as, can he play error-free baseball?
Right. Is he producing things like that? Right. I mean, like in a points-based fantasy baseball league, if you have a good OPS, you're a good fantasy baseball producer. It's really the easiest way to look at it. And if you have a low whip, you're a good fantasy baseball pitcher. All the other stats can be there, but I mean, this is why I always gravitate to these stats because I'm a fantasy baseball player and they're like the simplest way to look because does the guy produce offensively? Does the guy produce as a pitcher? So what's interesting, the first thing I noticed is first base, second base, third base, no White Sox. Like the Sox have nothing that's interesting to Scott White at all. He's going 15 players deep on prospects. Can't find a White Sox player. And Colson Montgomery, way down the list at shortstop.
What, 15th on this list?
I know. And the funny thing was last year we had him on the show and he was high on him. And he's basically sitting there going like, yeah, he didn't look good. I mean, like we get the prospect guys that come on. They tell you, oh, he looked good at the very end. And Scott White mentions that, hit 275 with 8 home runs in his final 37 games between AAA and the Arizona Fall League. But like, that's not getting him excited. He's got him 15th right now on the list of all these different guys that may or may not make it to the majors. And some of them are definitely not making it to the majors. And he'd rather have them over Colson Montgomery, who the general manager is indicating is going to get every opportunity to be the starting shortstop. So that kind of gives me pause. Our new acquisition in the outfield looks very good. We seem to have found a star in Braden Montgomery because he's not going to make it to the majors. He's never played in the minors. And Scott White has him 15th overall on a list of 25 outfield prospects. Like that's That's basically saying this guy's going to be a thing. You want to go get him, which I found was interesting. And we can get into maybe the pitchers. I'll just mention the pitchers real quick. Noah Schultz is a stud as far as White sees it, and he's coming this year. And the same thing with Hagen Smith, who he calls a just slightly shorter version of Noah Schultz. Like these are guys you want to go grab because they're going to produce very well in fantasy baseball this year. So that you're excited about those two names when you read the list. You go, oh, even the fantasy baseball guy's not so sure about Colson Montgomery. And then when you get the catcher, it becomes the most interesting. And that's why I brought this up. We talked about Edgar Quero on the last show. He makes the list. He is number 10 out of 10 catchers on his list. And,
just ahead of the bonus guy, Theron Lorenzo.
Right. And he gets bumped down mainly because Kyle Teal is now part of the organization. That's kind of how it's given. Like he says, Teal is the better of the two. That, yeah, Quero might get there first. But when Kyle Teal gets there, if you're trying to project out catcher, that's the guy you want on the White Sox, and he's the third best prospect in all of fantasy baseball catchers going into this year. And I want to read what he writes. Teal, the prize of the Garrett Crochet deal with the Red Sox, will rank lower on some lists because he lacks a standout tool. See, this is what I'm talking about. On a regular prospect list, they're looking at the tools. He's looking at what is he actually going to be as a ball player and will he produce stats? I'll continue. He's just so solid in every respect, doing yeoman's work over his 2 years in the minors that I could see him sneaking up on everyone, sort of like JT Realmuto did way back when. He's such a sure thing at such an unsure position that he may become a top 5 fixture by default, perhaps as soon as 2026. Scott White, a fantasy baseball writer, head guy at CBS Sports, and we've had him on before. He's gone through his methods and how he predicts these guys, and he's really good at his job. He's talking about him as a fixture in all of Major League Baseball. An offensive producer that would be in the top 5 offensive producers at catcher by 2026. That's what made me excited today. See, I'm telling you, I enter 2025 with hope. It may be silly hope. There might be somebody sitting there saying, shut up, Chris. I don't want to hear your hope. I want to live in 24 in the darkness. But it's a new day today and a new year, and that gives me hope.
Well, and the philosophy switch there, okay, it is right there in front of you, where Edgar Quero is a guy that we were told had a specific tool, his hit tool, right? That's his defense is, but this guy can rake. This guy is going to hit. He's just a hitter. And that's what the Han Williams regime always looked at were the tools. That's why Kenny would say things like, I can walk into a room and tell you who the all-star is going to be, because he's looking at rippling muscles, abs for days, chests, he's looking at that stuff. He's looking at rear ends is what he's looking at, okay, and calves. What does Kyle Teal represent? What was Chris Getz thinking when he got him? He's looking at this guy going, dude, he's got an all-around game. He's pretty good behind the plate. Is he great? No. Does he have a standout arm? Does he have a standout framing? No. It's not about the one tool, but he's a good, solid all-around catcher defensively. And offensively, he does everything pretty well. He hits for decent average. He'll hit for some decent power. He will strike out not as much as you'd be worried about, but not so little that you can sit there and say it's anything, amazing to watch. He's just a good all-around ball player like a JT Realmuto, right? And if the White Sox had 9 guys like that on their team, that's a competitive team. That's a really competitive team. If you've got 6 or 7 guys like that, that's a really competitive team, especially if the other 3 to 4 guys that you're talking about in your lineup, if you include somebody that's a bench player that's rotating in a lot, you're looking at if those guys have the exceptional tools. If you've got one of those guys, it's like a 40 home run threat every year. Okay, and that's his big tool. All right, that helps supplement if you've got a bunch of good all-around ball players. If you've got a guy that's a speedster, that'll get on base and can steal a base at a whim, and that's his major tool, but he can't hit the ball out of the infield hardly. Okay, well, that can be a useful thing. That can be a useful asset to have that there. If you're carrying a shortstop who is a defensive wizard but an offensive mediocrity, that can be a good thing. That's how roster building works. And so seeing that Kyle Teal and seeing that Braden Montgomery are on these lists for the idea that these guys are solid enough that they are always going to be potential producers. high-end producers in a system that values production, all-around production, more so than one single tool. Because if you look at fantasy baseball, and this is why I think this is a good metric when you and I have these discussions, if you look at fantasy baseball, a guy can hit 40 home runs, but if he strikes out 250 times, he's not worth as much as the guy who hits 25 home runs, but has a bunch of doubles, has a higher batting average, doesn't strike out as much, takes his walks, right? Has that higher on-base percentage or whatever. That's the change in philosophy. That's where, looking at 2025, you might sit there and say, hey, we're really still in the darkness. We're still in that shadow of 2024. We're still wading knee-deep in the muck that was 2024. But long term,
there's hope. There's a few pieces that are there. There's some changes that happen. There's something springing up there that it could turn into something really, really special.
Yeah.
And that's it. I'm telling you, man. I feel like my life is a parallel to the White Sox.
Look at the future, look long term, and you can see good things, you know?
Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement.
Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always on soxinthebasement.com.